Our next presenter will throw questions to the floor if time permits. The next speaker is Edward Farrell from Mercury Information Security. Edward is an independent information security consultant. His presentation is titled Cyber War, What is it good for? Please welcome Edward to the stage.
Thank you for the introduction, Brendan. G'day guys, my name's Edward Farrell and this is now my third year presenting at AusCERT, so thank you for having me back. It's always great to come up here. It's one of the more relaxed InfoSec events in Australia, so always good fun. Just briefly, a colleague asked me to make mention of an event he's holding in Melbourne on the 1st to the 2nd of July. UnrestCon, it's a little bit more of a smaller community-driven event. It's going to be good fun. I've been asked to do a few things there, so I hope to see a few more of you there in Melbourne in 5-6 weeks' time. So, cyber war. I suppose to understand why I went in for this talk and why I've been presenting on the subject a lot in the last 6 to 8 months is really to understand a little bit about myself. So I own and run my own pen testing firm in Sydney and have done so for about 15 months. And prior to that, I spent several years working for StratSec, BAE, Hack Labs, and a number of other organisations. And prior to that, I was also working as a network engineer. So I've come from this technical stream over the past 10, 15 years, which has formed me into my current role, where I do a fair amount in the security space, including vulnerability research and a few other bits and pieces. But at the same time, I've also been working a lot in the Army Reserve space as well for the last 8 years. I've generally speaking tried to separate both environments because they are different, and the last 2 to 3 years I've started to see a lot of convergence between the two, and so I've had my civilian career on one side and my military career on another, and they've started to, well, come into contact a lot more than I had expected. And so in one case you see on the information security side a lot of thinking around and a lot of incorrect thinking, in my opinion, as a soldier, around how we think about things militarily in the information security space. And then we're now starting to see the military space start to think about how we do technology, and they're trying to apply these other different concepts. And my biggest fear, and certainly one of the reasons why I talk about it a lot, is we're applying too much into the cyber and cyber war space, a lot of military thinking and principles in an environment that's far from militaristic. And that's something I've observed throughout my civilian career, prior to my military career, and even during. And for me, the big point around this comes back to that one word of what is cyber. I started seeing a lot of tweets and a lot of general discussion around the pessimism towards the word cyber about 5 years ago, and then industry suddenly adopted, saying, look, cyber is what our clients want, cyber is what our clients are going to get. But I then start dwelling, well, why? What is it? Is it meant to be computer networks? So why don't we refer to it as computer networks? Is it technology, or is it social media? Then why don't we reference it in that terminology? So for me, a lot of this questioning about, well, what is cyber, it throws a lot of people off balance when it's really just there to start to get that appreciation process flowing of establishing what exactly it is we want to talk about. Now, the US military defines cyberspace as a global domain within the information environment consisting of independent networks of information technology and infrastructures containing resident data. A bit of a mouthful. But then again, it highlights the term interdependent networks. Now, our speaker this morning highlighted Stuxnet, for example, and that was not necessarily an independent network. In fact, it was a very separate network. So does that still fall in that space, or does it not? So in this case, we have a form definition to meet a very specific aim, which, look, I commend them on it, but we then start seeing people deviate away from that definition. So a lot of the time, the absence of really properly defined terminology around this causes all sorts of issues. And if we looked at in a very Clausewitzian view, the inability to form these definitions is an immediate failure of the principles of war, which have dictated a lot of our militaries for the last 200 years. Things such as selection and maintenance of the aim, economy of effort, maintenance of momentum. Our inability to specify that end state will set us up for failure. So continuing on with that theme of what's wrong with using the word cyber, the big one for me is the actual etymology. So having done a bit of research on this, on where a lot of our modern thought process came about this, the language we use has a heavy foundation in 1980s science fiction to describe the environment that was evolving in the technology scene at the time. We then had a slightly less not safe for work definition in the 1990s, and then the word sort of faded away. 2 people got that joke. We then sort of saw the word fade away, and then we started to see its re-evolution into security and just security. I mean, I still yet to really hear it used isolated from the concept of security and defence. And so its place in science fiction as well, its reliance on fiction to create fact, has conjured up this great illusion. So we start communicating in these vague references where we don't have any actual facts, which means we lose value of what is said, we don't have any substance, and we set ourselves up for failure. And that disconnect is a massive miscommunication, and if we start seeing that in the category of leadership and the military space, if we can't conceptualize a problem, we can't plan for it, and therefore we fail our objective. We don't have one to fail. But then we start seeing also its continued use in a number of streams. And I'll touch on this a little bit later, where just by continuing use just as a general reference to anything, we can quite quickly lose understanding of what's taking place. And so when we don't actually answer this question properly, or when we have that backing that I mentioned, we start seeing really obscure things coming out. We start seeing Obama throughout his administration, and I'll discuss on this at several stages, has had a very heavy reliance on technology and technological concepts over strategy. And so all of a sudden, any illusionary events that take place in cyberspace can be met with a kinetic response. My favourite one is Islamic State militants, and the reference around they're going to kill us with cyber attacks. For those of us that have been doing our appreciation over the last 18 months of what's been taking place in that realm, a lot of their activities there focus quite heavily on the information dominance and influence sphere as opposed to any practical attacks. And that's really more so down to what we observe as a skill and their intent. One could argue that they have in fact been able to form that quite effectively based on their understanding. But we then sort of go down the list and we look at Donald Trump just as his election was starting to get started off. Before he wanted to build a Mexican wall, he was starting to consider building an internet wall, which, look, for me, fundamentally, I disagree with. At the end of the day, you know, the cultural and economic benefits we get from the internet are based on its openness, and this sudden knee-jerk response that we see based on all of this language is the end result of that. And then we start seeing other events that take place, such as the advocacy of backdoors or weakening security controls, and then just the sheer inability to understand it. Our keynote yesterday drew this for some of our key intelligence professionals during a Senate hearing, where for those of you that know Senator Ludlam, he's technically quite competent. I believe his background was web design, or he had a very strong technical background. His inability his questions threw a lot of people off guard. And so what we start to see is we start continuing this path down the wrong way. So immediately from the senior level, we have all of these statements that get pushed out, and then immediately under, people don't have any direction, and we set them up for failure. In the top left-hand screen, this is a joke around a lot of us in the information security industry around going full spectrum cyber to neutralise enemy threats. It's this wonderful little ad by Northrop Grumman of these digital soldiers retaking a power plant from a group of terrorists. A little less known was about 4 or 5 years ago, the Army started to try and re-educate its soldiers around cybersecurity, but the lack of understanding what was there resulted in some really poor outputs. So they had some videos that were barely seen that had a lot of very, I guess you could say, stereotypical approaches to who is online and who's attacking them, and just some really dodgy casts there. Now the other one down on the bottom is a solution that got put forward about 6 months ago by a firm in Canberra. This really just highlights ideas and solutions that haven't had any creative thought, or they're being framed completely in a militaristic mindset where, so if you have a look at the image, it's probably a little bit faded there, but the idea of this was, as a data loss prevention, any content that was opened would call back to a server when it was opened. And therefore, if someone unauthorized was opening it, it would do a callback. Of course, this comes back to that whole defense conceptualization of interconnected networks. Therefore, everything is going to be communicating back to us. And all I would need to do at the end of the day is probably unplug a network cable, and I may very well still be able to access documents. So without any knowledge or information that's an accurate reflection of the space at a lower level, because of influences that have happened higher up, we start setting up for failure. And so I argue whether this is as a result of, at a leadership level, individuals imposing their will, or those from the bottom up not being suitably trained or prepared, especially around correcting someone superior to them. So how do we start to resolve this? I mentioned before, as we start using the word cyber, as we start bringing it down to the engineering levels, the ongoing use of cyber doesn't actually provide any valuable contribution. So we already have this rich language in the information security industry around technology and what we're talking about that actually allows us to go to some level of depth when we're talking. It allows us to give task and purpose to the actions we've got to take, and it provides specificity at lower levels to provide a defined mission of what you want to do. So my favourite one is, you've probably heard a few vendors spruik it out there around cyber forensics, cyber penetration testing. Why don't we use the actual specific language that's already been around for the last 20 years? Things like cyber defence, why not computer network defence? And as a result of that, we can actually start isolating ourselves to, all right, we've only got to focus on the defence of these computer networks. And so leading on from this, we start thinking of things around cyber war. And at the end of the day, we start to take we start to remove the fanciful language, and it just, at the end of the day, happens to be a bunch of us nerds on computers. And now that's not to say we haven't fully established its military context, but we start from that appreciation and we can start building up from there. And so on the subject of military approaches, I come back to this leadership level where we have what I refer to as a pontification of cyber. Now, at a senior level, we start seeing that lack of technical comprehension, which prevents or alternates intents, and individuals start to get defined by the word. The photo I have up there is General Keith Alexander at DEFCON 20, who everyone was actually anticipating a really thought-provoking, detailed talk to come out. He went on stage and had told us cyber is good, children are our future, and we don't spy on people. A year later, that story, at least one part of that story did change. But we start having, as a result of this, all these social biases. Leaders tend to have a lot of social biases formed on prior learning. So militaries will fight as they did in their last war. And that's what leaders get used to. So individuals forming their opinions on the ground at the time will then start playing that out because it's worked successfully in the past. And so within this space, we are seeing what I would say is the strategic piece that's been flogged to death pretty hard. We're seeing a lot of top-down, as I said, pontification without the knowledge or technical intricacies. Now, we talked about before the almost reliance on fiction or magic to create what we would classify as cyber effects means that absence of understanding starts to set up these lower levels for failure. Another favourite one I have here is when people start articulating in this space that they're not technical, which isn't anything wrong. But one of the things you start to observe based on an individual's approach is how they start presenting themselves as not technical, as to whether it's I understand the fundamental concept of something and can direct it appropriately, or is it a case of this is all someone else's problem and I'm just sitting here. And you start to see the measure of leadership then becomes to what's their approach and what's the outcomes that you start observing. Does it turn into a dismissal of technology as a magical box that does something? Does this start to become a divisive characteristic of that individual? The problem here is, as I alluded to with some of the leadership strategies we've seen in the past, we start seeing problems get isolated to technical problems that demand technical solutions. And that starts to become quite dangerous. So when we start isolating all this thought process to leadership that doesn't necessarily present itself as having an understanding at a fundamental level, we start going down this nexus of where our problems all of a sudden become attributed to a single solution in order to, say, justify our use of force. And so, having existed in both domains, I start to observe the outcomes within the military sense to be very similar to some of the things we started seeing in Mosul 2014. So we're now starting to see this evolution of large bureaucracies and governance in order to achieve these missions, or whatever cyber is. Very similar to Mosul 2014, we started to see this translate into what I would classify as draconian defence measures that are labour intensive. And this is something that I've observed in cyberspace as some organisations start to build up their capability in that area, which means that we start seeing frustrated users. Now, I guess the biggest issue they had in Mosul then was the complete ideological separation between the Sunni North and the Shia South. Do we start seeing that similar divisiveness in cyberspace? I suppose maybe not, but you started seeing, as the defence of Mosul was prepared, a lot of intrusive activities that provided no material value to the defence, and it frustrated everyone. And then all of a sudden you had the outcome of this was that there was a lot of money being thrown with no oversight and no actual value. So this, I suppose both of those points leads into that strategy with technology will always trump this technological approach that we isolate ourselves to. And we sort of saw symptoms of this in our keynote on Wednesday, where there's this ongoing persistence or this illusion that technology will solve our problems. The idea that we can tap all the signals and therefore we can listen on everything and the problem is solved. And we're not seeing that. So conversely, it's going to be our ability to manage technology that will win. And it's not just the strategy alone. And we see this right now in a lot of policies in the US. There's currently an over-reliance on the ISR capabilities of the US government, such as drones. We saw the other week the assassination of a Taliban leader using a drone, which for a lot of people, we've got that blinkered footage of the drone strike taking place. But what we don't have is an appreciation of what is taking place in the physical domain as a result of those events. And classic case in point was the Pakistani response, which is this violates our sovereignty. You've upset a lot of our locals here. This isn't going to go down too well. And so as we start isolating cyber as this fifth domain, we then start seeing that exact same problem start to emerge, where we don't understand that the world is interconnected and that the ubiquity of technology tied in with that means that this is no longer a self-licking ice cream. We actually need to have some level of interaction. And to start with, in the military space, I think it's important to understand what modern conflict looks like. I'm a big fan of this author, David Kilcullen. He's an Australian who had architected Petraeus's surge strategy in Iraq in 2008, which, look, a lot of people have said, had that been maintained, it would have led to the complete annihilation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then evolved into the Islamic State. But the point the author makes, David, is that we're now facing, as he puts it, an urban network littoral. The explosion of electronic connectivity changes the environments and the threats we encounter. And you've seen this consistently, and the author actually draws on to what we saw in the Mumbai attacks in 2006 or 2008. Don't quote me on that one. But the point he gets at was the adversary's use of communication and the absence of communication within Blue 4 or Green 4 within the civilian space as well as the military space, being unable to grip it up, not necessarily through spying or through any intrusive means, but being able to coordinate a response effectively had meant that the damage that was done was considerable. But what will our modern conflicts look like? We've got a massive urbanisation of populations. We're also starting to see an overpopulation, especially in the developing world. Now, these combined with environmental degradation, which to a lesser extent we've seen in Syria and Iraq, and certainly in parts of northern Africa, means that there's going to be shortages of food and water. But we've also seen the failure of governments and of governments, including a lot of their supporting infrastructure and assets. So do these then start to form into what our response is going to be? And I'll touch on that shortly. Firstly, though, my big concern is our own internal complexity within networks. This is an unclassed screenshot of what's taking place in JP2072, which is the modernisation of the Australian Army for a hardened and network army, where there's now more communications at the section level than there at the 8-person level than there were at company size of 100, 120 people from 30 years ago. So we start seeing all this complex warfighting getting introduced, and then we start still seeing the resolution. We continue to see oversimplified terminology getting referenced in order to articulate the environment. Now, I'm in two minds about how the hardened and networked army can be secured. Firstly, the complexity of this space kind of contributes to its security, in that the ability to execute attack is somewhat delayed provided certain provisions exist. Now, having stated that, we then start looking at specific architectural considerations on this battle space. So we start looking at compartmentalization, making it slow and expensive to attack, and we actually start tying that in with early action and detection. And these are going to be the things that will defend the modern network, not necessarily rolling all out with sensors everywhere and engaging in labour-intensive activity in order to defend. And this really starts coming back to design, implementation, and getting those basic concepts right. But then we start looking at that, we start considering that the size and complexity of it means our ability to adapt quickly can also be hampered. And you see a lot of defence contractors take a very historical approach to how we engage. In that they still think we're manufacturing aircrafts and ships, which means that these projects need to be long, cumbersome, and expensive. If you ever get the chance, look at the Cyber Fast Track series in the US that was managed by DARPA. A piece of technology that came out of that was a device built for about $4,000, which effectively neutralised the ability for mobile phone-based improvised explosive devices in Iraq. Ask me after this talk to go into a little bit more detail about that. So we're also now conceptualising war, and my big fear is we're still actually placing too much of our emphasis on the lower stages of war. War is itself a massive spectrum from peace to certain activities that lead to an eventual destabilisation and then all-out war. Low-intensity conflicts and counterinsurgency events are going to be the thing that we are more than likely going to encounter, and the last thing we want is those things to degrade and evolve. And so one of the things I seriously advocate is actually the use of technology long before that in order to prevent that degradation. And I guess this comes back to my other big fear within that space is we are now starting to see everyone start applying cyber in a traditional militaristic role, which is to seek out and close with the enemy, to kill or capture them, and to seize and hold ground. So I started talking about that early, that strategic component of early intervention, early responses, and using technology to prevent going down this sliding scale. And there's already a few really good ideas out there that we are starting to see. This is from a group called Crisis Maps, who responded to the events that took place in Haiti. What had happened in Haiti was, I mentioned earlier, issues with failed governments or ineffective governments. Because the government was not prepared to respond, as well as, say, a Western nation, things descended into chaos quite quickly. So the ability to deploy a supporting element to aid NGOs in providing a humanitarian assistance was important. And you've seen this a lot with crisis maps. Now, the other thing you started to see specifically in the case of Haiti was they were able to start liaising, they were able to take advantage of Haitian translators in the United States to aid in the response effort. So this is a classic case of, here's a piece of technology a couple of guys have innovated that's provided a C2 mechanism for a humanitarian response, which realistically, if you look at Australia's activities in Fiji, in the Solomon Islands, that's exactly what we've done. The Solomon Islands is an interesting case, and I'd really like to investigate further as to whether there's technological solutions we could have introduced that could have aided in preventing that degradation to civil unrest. But I guess the other thing here militaristically is we can start layering in some other effects on top of this. The same technology we use for rogue base stations could quite easily be repurposed to get communications lines re-established. One of the big growth areas you see in you see in the developed world is the use of mobile phones, which of course rely on being able to have effective and functional base stations. The same technology we use to intercept could very well be repurposed to aid in the event those stations go down. This is a screenshot from a map published by a group called liveuamap.com. They originally started out as a response, as a civilian response to the events that were taking place in the eastern Ukraine, where they were able to provide spatial open source intelligence on events as they took place. One of the things that you've certainly seen a lot here is that there's been a fair amount of transparency in what is taking place on the ground, because everyone now has an iPhone and we've now got the means with which to collate that data. I'm not too sure if you're aware, but Ramadi right now is slowly getting retaken by Iraqi security forces, and we can start seeing just down towards the bottom right the actions that are taking place there. What was interesting about this map as well, about this service as well, was we started seeing Russian forces in September starting to go through the Bosphorus in support of Syria, long before the media actually published it, or before a lot of us even knew what was going to be happening. So once again, awesome source of information that could in fact be perhaps better used. This is a photo of an ICS lab down at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Now, the first thought a lot of people have around this is, all right, industrial control systems, whoop-de-doo, we're going to use it to start blowing up power plants and causing all sorts of damage, and then blowing up dams and reliving 617 Squadron. The reality is, though, and something I advocate quite heavily, is the conflicts we're going to be responding to in the next few years is going to be things such as the breakdown of government, or it's going to be the breakdown of the ability to provide services. Given the ubiquity of technology and the rise of a lot of smart cities, being able to come in and re-establish the functions of a normal society is in fact more important than going in there and starting to destroy everything, which is more often than not the traditional assumption of what most modern militaries do. Now, the same skill sets and attributes we have to people that would normally be out there to be destructive on these items of technology, the same skills and attributes we will probably need should we go into a place where we don't necessarily understand the technology that's there. So when I was recently writing a bunch of scenarios for a few events and exercises coming up, and one of the things that I was really pushing quite heavily was, instead of using your technology professionals to go out and start tearing things up, use them as what we call a CIMIC function, a civil and military cooperation, where we're going in and we're starting to restabilise nations. And my biggest fear is that we are not taking that as the appreciation of cyber in the military domain, just because it's not sexy enough. So what conclusions have I been drawing over the last 18 months of working this? Well, I've probably started to find myself just constantly asking more questions than anything else. I mean, do we start defining cyber and what cyber is? I tend not to go down that path for the simple fact that we then start isolating what we do. I still don't think we have had enough time in this space to start isolating ourselves. One thing that is evident is that in a military context, taking militarized approaches of seeking out closing with the enemy to kill or capture them isn't exactly the most appropriate. But once again, if militaries are looking at how and where we adapt this, what will be. And I suppose there comes in a slightly more balanced approach that needs to take place over the next 3 to 5 years. The reliance on technology we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years, especially around the Obama government, has actually been not as successful as if there was, once again, a more balanced approach. And yet we're also seeing at the same time a very information-heavy, leadership-heavy strategy as well. And they're not quite paired up there they're not pairing up as well as we'd expect. So once again, there's both that balance of technology and leadership, but then of course there's a hell of a lot more complexity to that we can't exactly fit into 40 minutes, balancing with external objectives, avoiding what I referred to before as that self-licking ice cream strategy of cyber only being for its own benefit. How we balance that is going to be one of the challenges over the next 3 to 5 years. And this is where I start talking about taking those innovative paths that we've already started to see out there that we can use to motivate and inspire. I suppose where I get at there is that necessity and survival are the mother of innovation, and I don't think a lot of our approaches are harnessing those yet. So these are things that I believe we'll start to see rise over the next 3 to 5 years as this environment starts to change. So that's all I had in cyber. So, guys, thanks for having me here and listening to me. Do we have any questions?
Look, I'll have one. Ed, have you presented this to anyone in the military, and what reactions have you got if you have?
There have been tidbits of this or anecdotes. So my favourite one is asking the what is cyber, and that starts to throw people off guard. And then there's that thought process that starts to happen of, okay, well that's probably what we should be doing. So I think for a lot of people that sudden stop has actually been quite valuable for them.
Do you not think that the use of cyber, especially in the non-technical operational lines, is just simply a consequence of human laziness? I mean, for goodness sake, we say SQL server is SQL server. That's as simple as not wanting to say too many syllables, for goodness sakes.
So you're saying that terms of reference are inconsistent, or
I'm not saying that, I'm just asking you whether you think it's just for the simple thing. You asked the question, why do we say cyber
as opposed to going into greater depth on other things? Yep.
simple laziness? Is that not the case?
Yeah, well, look, you've got to do a 30-second grab when you start interacting with a lot of other people. I mean, I come from a technical background. I love going on a really, really deep dive on a subject. A lot of people don't have, and as you quite rightly put, a lot of people don't have the desire to go to that depth, and therefore, yeah, we immediately jump to cyber. So yes, no, fair point. Any more questions?
A quick one.
Yes.
Do we define cyber? Do we define Navy? So if we define Navy
Mm-hmm.
as defence of our water interests,
Yep.
is cyber defence then defence of our information infrastructure as much as Navy protects our water infrastructure? In other words, can't we apply the same definitions today to what we mean by Air Force, Navy, Army?
Okay, so I'll throw another one into you there. We've just talked about our information infrastructure. Does that also incorporate our control systems infrastructure? That's not necessarily an information element, but does that feature in there as well? And these then start to become the complexities we start throwing into this. I don't think it's a case of we immediately make that jump. I think it's more so over time we start establishing what we're talking about. And this, I think it's still something that is evolving. I guess that's the point I've tried to draw at there, is that, I mean, navies themselves, well, even formed militaries took several hundred years to evolve, as did a navy that was dedicated purely to the defence of a nation's maritime interests. So those, I suppose we're still in that forming stage. Interesting sort of point, but I think it's a case of, yeah, it took time to evolve, and we'll take time to evolve that here.
I base the point on the fact that the totality of the nation now depends on its national information infrastructure as much as the Navy with the critical outfields in our waters.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, like you, are we gradually getting towards what are we defending? I'm not talking about what those traditional forces use themselves, C4I. I'm talking about why and what are we defending?
Yeah. Interesting. Yep. So were there any other questions? No, guys, look, thanks for listening and staying around. I'll be here throughout the conference if you wanted to ask me anything else or catch up. I'll be here. Thanks again.